So there will be three parts to this. And the first one is how this came into being. Increasingly, in the last few years, certain of the questions we're called to face: climate change, the Anthropocene, a possibly irreversible collapse of the biosphere, have taken center stage for many, if not all of us. In my case, while they reshaped much of my mental and experiential approach to the meaning and implications of our individual and collective role on Earth at this time, they also inevitably led me to reappraise my role as a teacher and my purpose as a researcher and a writer. Lots of things find a home these days in academia within the loose and porous umbrella term environmental humanities. Personally, I felt called by a somewhat more specific approach to these matters: the embodied relationship between us and the world. An approach that Arne Næss called some 50 years ago deep ecology, and which is being renamed in certain quarters these days depth ecology. Depth having to do less with the implicit shallowness of a technologically driven, solution-oriented type of ecology, and more with the inner psychic component of a self-realization grounded in biocentric diversity and equality. This means investing our human nature in a fully embodied and fully engaged relationship with the multiple dimensions in which we live: the atmosphere, the biosphere, the ethnosphere, and the psychosphere, all of which demand of us, for their survival, that we engage in conscious conviviality with all what I like to call, after David Abram, the more than human world, rather than the other than human world. And I think that through the talk, it will become increasingly clear the meaning of this more rather than other than human world. All this has led me over the last few years to create and teach a course called Think Like a Forest, a dialogue between pre-modern worldviews, environmental humanities, indigenous knowledge, to edit a collection of essays titled Oikosophia, From the Intelligence of the Heart to Ecophilosophy, and more recently, to publish an article titled Kuntraval Laigo, where I reflect on the journey that brought me to reconnect with the memory of my own indigeneity. This train of thought and experiential understanding has in turn led me to ask myself other different questions in regard to Dante and Montaigne, to identify or try to, in their way of thinking, their cosmology and epistemology, a commitment to finding a new language aimed at expressing the renewed communion with the world that their quest for meaning had brought into focus. Through the summer, I made a first version translation into Italian of David Abram's The Spell of the Sensuous, and attended at the end of August a 4-day camp on depth ecology at Hollyhock with David Abram, Wade Davis, Rex Wheeler, Nora Bateson, and with some 50 other attendees. It was a rich conversation, and I am excited to share at least some of its reverberations. Why depth ecology, then? Because this approach aims at involving not the self-assurance of the hard sciences and the problem-solving, technologically oriented rational mind, but rather the gropings, the shadowed hesitancies, the unknowing of our deep psyche, in Jungian terms, our personal and collective unconscious. The way we speak or fail to, the way we can transform our understanding of the living bond that ties us to the world. There is one aspect in particular I'd like to explore with you, and that is language in a depth ecology perspective. What I'm about to share is not a formal paper, not even the preliminary results of a research in progress. Right now, these are just a handful of considerations, followed by a simple collage of quotes, which I hope you will find enticing enough to wish to enter into a conversation on these matters with me. So, language, culture, and the art of spelling. We have all been schooled. We have all become literate. A university degree, that which all of us gathered here have, offer, and/or are in the process of acquiring at this institution, is the epitome of literacy. So quite naturally, we all believe this is a good thing. And of course, it is. Yet literacy, as I'm about to contend, is a phenomenon more complex and of more far-reaching implications than we're normally aware of. In becoming thoroughly accustomed to it, somewhere, somehow, we have lost track of its spelling power. We use it daily, mindless of its trade-offs through the millennia, and close to unaware of its implications in today's world. Literacy has shaped and keeps shaping our way of being, of thinking, of relating to the world. As individuals in connection with each other, as societies and cultures in contact with one another, as human beings in rapport with the, once again, more than human world. And of course, when I say literacy, I mean reading and writing, but I also, and perhaps especially, I mean all that goes with it in a world dominated by computers and digital communication. In what direction is this relatively new kind of literacy taking us? What type of exchanges and interaction is it directing us to engage in? And conversely, which other exchanges and interactions is it forcing us to forget, to ignore, to suppress? And finally, how aware are we of the spell that the art of spelling has cast and keeps casting in us as individuals, as cultural institutions, as human societies defined by the power of literacy in relation to the world, which we call illiterate, but was in fact the world of orality, now stripped of its own spelling power. We have become so utterly immersed in literacy, in the written signs through which we share our knowledge and understanding, that we do not even ask ourselves if and in what ways this potent tool affects our perception and understanding of the world, and therefore of our way of relating or failing to relate to and with all that does not communicate or express itself through literacy. We have, in other words, become accustomed to thinking that literacy is synonymous with language, for the simple reason that literacy is synonymous with civilization, and civilization has long been understood as synonymous with being human. This has been especially true in a colonizing context, even though the same process was at work throughout Europe for centuries before being exported to other continents. We who are involved in the advent of Romance languages literacy know how complex and at times conflictual that process was. Were we willing seriously to entertain the possibility that literacy is a tool that certain human groups developed in a relatively recent past, the last handful of millennia, for specific, mostly practical purposes, and we could even define the various components of that practicality or expediency, This would allow us to see, at least if through a veil, another world underneath the one we're familiar with. A world not yet entirely vanished, but definitely receding into irrelevance in a globalized and globalizing perspective. I mean the world of oral cultures, the world of vernaculars and dialects, and to an as yet unascertained degree, the world of poetry, the world of affect and perception. I'd like to evoke just three very brief examples, three short contemporary poetic pronouncements to give you a direct sense of what I am referring to when I say that poetry is language, but aiming at something that literacy, even against its better will, more often than not, ends up systematically displacing, disfiguring, silencing. As the cricket's soft autumn hum is to man, so is man to the trees, as they are to the rocks and the hills. Tired of all who come with words, words but no language, I went to the snow-covered island. The wild does not have words. The unwritten pages spread themselves out in all directions. I come across the marks of roe deer's hooves in the snow. Language, but no words. Not to be cut off, not through the slightest partition, shut out from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it, if not intensified sky, hurled through with birds and deep with the winds of homecoming. We take it for granted that the world we live and operate in is the obvious result of the spread of literacy as civilization, of national languages as a hallmark of cultural progress. And yet, we live in a time when we're also called to awaken to the complexity of different natural ecosystems whose endangerment by globalized civilization ultimately threatens so-called civilization itself. Hence, we're equally called, as students and teachers of languages and cultures rich with local traditions, to take a deep look at the eco and ethno-systems out of which the languages we speak and teach emerged and imposed themselves through the centuries. I'm obviously referring to languages such as Catalan, Basque, Provençal, Occitan, to name the most immediately obvious. Languages, the political history de facto demoted to irrelevance, or at the very least tried and still tries to. But what about the regional cultures whose identities were shaped by vernacular oral expressions and traditions, not to mention the myriad indigenous languages and cultures whose identity has been defaced or silenced by colonization, in Europe just as much as in the Americas? I believe we're called, I was saying, to become aware that this wealth of cultural and linguistic expressions is becoming extinct in the same way that old-growth forests and countless animal species are endangered. And along with the languages, it is also the way of being in the world that characterize those oral languages, those regional vernaculars, which now verges on extinction. Our colleague Wade Davies has compellingly argued the myriad of cultures in the world with their own traditions and beliefs are not failed attempts at modernity, let alone failed attempts to be us. Each as an inspired expression of our collective genius, each a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? All have an equal claim on reality, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. Every culture has something to say, and each deserves to be heard. We may think that this is an issue better addressed in the departments of anthropology or geography. But when Wade more specifically addresses the issue of the ethnosphere, we may come to realize that the complex heritage of the Romance world is implicated in the process as well, so that the way we understand and teach this heritage becomes entangled in ecological matters, and deeply so. The ethnosphere is a notion perhaps best defined as the sum total of all thoughts, beliefs, myths, and intuitions made manifest today by the myriad cultures of the world. The ethnosphere is humanity's greatest legacy. It is the product of our dreams, the embodiment of our hopes, the symbol of all that we are and all that we have created as a wildly inquisitive and astonishingly adaptive species. We would also have to consider the possibility, which biology, ethology, and forest studies have been entertaining more and more seriously, that every non-human being is endowed with means of communication, hence with a form of language, of memory, of identity, both as an individual and as a species, and that the communicative interactions among these other beings are languages from which we have for centuries now estranged ourselves. The ecological crisis we're all a part of, the obvious dominance that the human species has acquired in and on the world, is deeply related, it seems to me, not just to the economy and the politics of our anthropocentric societies, but to something much more fundamental and, in a sense, much more insidious: the way in which we have turned everything else into a resource or a commodity for our own purposes. And that which made this possible may be directly related to the one thing which is at the center of our attention and professional interest: language and languages. Something intervened within the human sphere of existence. A closure occurred the moment human beings, some human beings at any rate, established that language was their own purview and unique possession, that which set them apart from a world physically alive, but allegedly deprived of the nobility of speculative intellection. The time when this shift occurred was when literacy took control of society. Language as script was declared the unique achievement of humanity. We can see how fundamental this divide became precisely through the history of colonialism, first in Europe and then throughout the rest of the world. The encounter of civilized, literate people with oral peoples systematically led to the demise of the oral cultures and their oral ways of being, of knowing, and of relating to the more than human world, because the literate, technologically empowered conquerors deemed those cultures primitive, due precisely to their lack of literacy. I don't need to belabor how related to literacy the processes of conquest and control have been and still are. We have traded, at least in part, Christianity with consumerism. But the fundamental premise on which the power of these beacons of civilization is based is one and the same: literacy as a tool for domesticating the human mind to the anthropocentric perspective, a tool for severing the human mind from the wild, more than human perspective, where everything is not only alive, but aware, sensing, and communicating. This is, of course, poses the question of where language and mind as awareness are located. If we say in the human brain, then we're called to face the global catastrophe that such a view has brought upon the earth. Essentially, in the very short span of time of that handful of millennia in which literacy has become the tool of human dominance over the earth. Today, we know that indigenous oral cultures have been able to maintain a different relationship with the rest of the living world based precisely on the notion, some would say the belief, that language as mind as awareness are not located in the human brain, but are pervasive of the biosphere, coextensive with life itself. And simply replacing the grossly inadequate label primitive that our forefathers coined and stuffed with their own projections of self-styled civilized people with a new, seemingly more apt term such as indigenous or aboriginal, won't help much if we do not ask ourselves what we stand to lose through the loss of their as our vanishing way of living, of speaking, of thinking, of sensing, and experiencing. Robert Brinkhurst has dared to call this type of thinking, which endures through the centuries within the recesses of literacy, moral knowledge. Let me quote a few lines from his recent wrenching, The Ridge. What I mean by moral knowledge is visceral on principle and not theoretical knowledge. Understanding in the gut that reaches all the way into the sizzling blizzard of ash and the shattered combustible heart of the forest and all the way out of the self-immolating stars. It's a kind of poetry, this knowledge. There is nothing you can do with it, except what you can always do with knowledge and with beauty. You can cradle them like water in your body and your mind, and let them hold you also in the palm of all your senses. Moral knowledge is a fragrance that the mind sometimes gives off, like shore pine, Nootka rose, or sweetgrass in the sun. It is the transcendental scent of simply seeing how it is. In the intangible landscape of knowledge, almost everything is breathing almost all the time. That kind of breathing is called thinking. How it works is that it takes you by surprise and asks for nothing in return. I am interested in retrieving at least the awareness, if not the memory, of this process and what it entails. And I'm equally interested in entering in a conversation with all of you regarding the possibility of relating to literacy in a more mindful manner, in a manner that would allow us not to fall under the spell of literacy's shadow, so that conversely, we might also find ways of recovering a different relationship to orality, to language in its aliveness, in its more than written expressive dimension, within the breathing landscape of moral knowledge as thinking. I have a hunch that perhaps in slightly different terms, many of you might already be engaged in a similar process. That some of you might tell me, why, this is exactly what I do, what I love, what I pursue. So what follows in the third and last part of this presentation is a little collage of excerpts, as if there wasn't already enough, around this subject, as my aim today is simply to share a few thoughts, as I said, and get a conversation going. I'm sure you will have other thoughts, excerpts, experiences, other shards and slivers to contribute to this collage. So I want to return to David Abram, who is the ecologist philosopher who in our time, more than anyone else that I am aware of, has called our attention to the psychic processes set in motion by literacy as transformative of our relationship with the more than human world, while at the same time advocating for a better understanding of the implications of orality and finding ways of reclaiming an oral awareness within and through our literate worldview. Here are a couple of quotes from his work with regard, first of all, to literacy. The process of learning to read and to write with the alphabet engenders a new, profoundly reflexive sense of self. The fact that one's scripted words can be returned to and pondered at any time that one chooses, regardless of when or in what situation they were first recorded, grants a timeless quality to this new reflective self, a sense of the relative independence of one's verbal, speaking self from the breathing body with its shifting needs. The literate self cannot help but feel its own transcendence and timelessness relative to the fleeting world of corporeal experience. The Socratic Platonic psyche, in other words, is none other than the literate intellect, that part of the self that is born and strengthened in relation to the written letters. And with regard to a new awareness of language, this is from his second book called Becoming Animal and Earthly Cosmology. Words are human artifacts, are they not? Surely to speak or to think in words is necessarily to step back from the world's presence into a purely human sphere of reflection. Such precisely has been our civilized assumption. But what if meaningful speech is not an exclusively human possession? What if the very language we now speak arose first in response to an animate, expressive world as a stuttering reply, not just to others of our species, but to an enigmatic cosmos that already spoke to us in a myriad tongues? What if thought is not born within the human skull, but is a creativity proper to the body as a whole, arising spontaneously from the slippage between an organism and the folding terrain that it wanders? What if the curious curve of thought is engendered by the difficult eros and tension between our flesh and the flesh of the earth? And I also want to come back to Robert Brinkhurst, who on these shores that we call home has done tremendous work at the gates between orality and literacy, endeavoring to open those gates and make those borderlines permeable. There is an essay of his that I find especially compelling these days in particular. It was delivered in 1998, close to a quarter of a century ago, at the University of Victoria. Its title is The Vocation of Being. You'll be surprised by its visionary quality in relation to today's main issues. Towards the end of that essay, Robert dared to tackle the intractable question of the nature and objectives of the residential schools and of universities. Literacy is at the heart of it. Here. The goal of the residential schools was to transform hundreds of distinct indigenous societies into a single alternative and thereby to replace a sustainable condition of cultural prosperity with a regime of increasing material wealth and political cohesion. The cultural prosperity of North America before the colonization arose from the fact that human cultures were sustained within the larger culture, which is nature as a whole. But to those who ran the schools, the integration of humans with their natural environment was not just undesirable, it was evil. It was satanic. The schools therefore taught the subjugation of nature as a duty. The biosphere is a self-policing system. Plainly, it can tolerate human participation. Human management is something else again. But the unsustainability of a human-centered system posed no problem for those who ran the residential schools. If they were faithful to their creed, they expected the age of human mastery to give way in its turn to the universal kingdom of God. Take God out of the equation, and you have the modern public university, as its political masters conceive it. It is an institution that aims at a secular millennium, a global state of limitless material prosperity managed and controlled by human beings. Most of those elected to public office in the present day appear to actively believe in or passively consent to such a vision. But many who work inside the university and some who come to study there know that the human millennium is unsustainable. The steady increasing cultural poverty and material sterility which the search for that millennium has brought are only a foretaste of what it will actually cost. And 25 years later, I think we're getting just about the bill. There's more. The cheerful term post-colonial, which I often hear on campuses these days, might suggest that the age of destruction is over. In fact, the colonization is still at fever pitch. The great transformation of gold into lead and of forests into shopping malls continues. Some analogous transformations can be seen at the university itself. One of the reagents used for this purpose is the acid of postmodernism, the thesis that nothing has meaning because everything is language. It works especially well in parallel with the acid of unrestrained commerce, that nothing has meaning because everything is for sale. Repeated exposures to these ideological acids produces human beings who cannot wonder at the world because they are not at all sure that the world exists, though they can wonder all the more at social power and reputation. When you take the world away from a human being, something less than a human being is left. That is the inverse of education. To me, it is clear that things have meaning because they are meaning, and that language has meaning or can have meaning because it can speak, poorly but truly, of some of the things that language is not. Robert Brinkhurst is the poet-topographer, one of those rare human animals who has been able, through a lifetime of dedicated pursuit, to rewild the literacy and the written page. He knows how to ensure that the spell of spelling remain anchored to the ecology of orality. And so inevitably, I cannot but end up recalling the story that is at the root of our world's fall under the spell of spelling. The story that Socrates tells his disciple Phaedrus when he realized that this young man holds in his hands a written copy of a discourse that Phaedrus admires so much that he wants to learn it by heart. So learning by heart and having it on paper or whatever was the support. Plato's Dialogues, a written version of oral exchanges between an illiterate philosopher and his disciple, took shape in writing just at the time when writing was beginning to shape the philosophical mind in Greece, by waving goodbye to the inherently oral knowing of the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. As you will see, moral knowledge is what's at stake here. As some of you may remember, Socrates evokes a mythical Egyptian king, the King Thamus, who tells the god Thoth that his invention of writing was bound to be a catastrophe for humanity. And our literate culture never knew exactly what to make of this warning, ferried into the harbor of literacy from the open sea of orality. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented a pharmacon, not of memory, but of reminding. And you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom, for they will read many things without instruction, and will therefore seem to know many things when they are, for the most part, ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise, but only appear wise. In pre-literate times, human beings were able to hear and understand the language spoken by other than human speakers. So Socrates says to Phaedrus, "They used to say, my friend, that the words of the oak and the holy place of Zeus at Dodona were the first prophetic utterances. The people of that time, not being so wise as you young folks, were content in their simplicity to hear an oak or a rock, provided only it spoke the truth. But to you, perhaps, it makes a difference who the speaker is and where he comes from, for you do not consider only whether his words are true or not." A couple of days ago, as I was rereading the notes I took this summer in view of this talk, I was shocked to realize that on Friday, the day after tomorrow, Canada will be celebrating the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. There was no plan to bring these thoughts in alignment with that event, but spelling is, as you have come to see, a double-edged word. So we will be celebrating, or perhaps more appropriately, observing. As things stand at the moment, there is nothing much to celebrate and quite a bit to mourn for or about. I'm far from referring to the past only. The present and the future seem as dark, if not darker, beneath well-tended, glossy appearances and some unquestionably good will. Because on which side of the words truth and reconciliations are we literate Canadians going to meet, to the best of our intentions, whatever is left of our oral Indigenous brothers and sisters? If the rift that has opened around the residential schools had everything to do with schooling and literacy, that rift has now become a gaping chasm inside each one of us, regardless of the side we take on these matters. As Bringhurst could clearly see back in 1998, our mindset has not changed much. But today, the multiple catastrophes which haunt us from all sides, from climate change to pandemics, from the collapse of the ecosystems to the threat of a global nuclear conflict, are telling us how adrift our language as system of relations has become, how removed we are from the living reality that we still, and more than ever, need in order to sustain the illusion of our unsustainable ideals and endeavors, how shamelessly disconnected our words are from the glaring reality of our dying planet. Hence, I'd like to end by paying homage to another way of relating to language and to the living world. And I'll do so first through the words of Nalunjak, an Inuit woman who at the beginning of the last century could still say, in the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal if he wanted to, and an animal could become a human being. Sometimes they were people, and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. That was a time when words were like magic. The human mind had mysterious powers. A word spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It would suddenly come alive, and what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. Nobody could explain this. That's the way it was. Nalunjak's remembering of this ancestral moral knowledge is not unique to indigenous peoples of the New World. In the 1580s, in laying out the specificities of his essays, Montaigne had said, "Les sciences traitent les choses trop finement, d'une mode trop artificielle et différente à la commune et naturelle. Si j'étais du métier, je naturaliserais l'art autant comme ils artialisent la nature. Pour ce mien dessin, il me vient aussi à propos d'écrire chez moi, un pays sauvage, où personne ne m'aide ni me relève, où je ne hante communément personne qui entende le latin de son patenôtre et de français, un peu moins." In 2020, Manchan Magan published 32 Words for Field, where he meditates on old Irish words and the nuances of a way of life that is vanishing with them. Ultimately, he says, what all of these words aim to do is to reveal the underlying connections that our ancestors saw between all things, from fields and flowers to hawks and waves. Separately, they may seem outdated and awkward to pronounce and spell, but together they make clear how ancestral languages can steer us back to what truly matters, allowing us to make sense of an increasingly chaotic world by reintroducing us to the mysterious glories of the natural world and the subterranean existence of all things. I'll stop here.